In Scotland, proud land of traditions with memories of bitter battles, people talk about human rights for children at school or elsewhere as though they were a given. Today, those rights are taken for granted, but years ago it was a completely different story. In those days, teachers had absolute power and the right to beat children. Children did as they were told, and if not, the leather belt was there for physical punishment. During the 70s, Grace Campbell, a mother from Glasgow, decided to lead the battle against the belt and against head teachers and the prevailing mentality. She took her case to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg and won. The Campbell case made history. The day after the judgment, she declared,
"I'm very pleased with the outcome of the case and feel that a speedy implementing of the findings will improve the educational environment for both teachers and pupils. I would point out that this was a private case brought to the court without support from any other outside parties. I think obviously the result of the case will benefit all British children."
Our philosophy was quite simple. You just don't hit children. It's that simple. The idea that physical punishment is something to do with discipline is nonsense. It is not synonymous with discipline, it's synonymous with child abuse. End of story. It's that simple. You just don't do it.
The Campbells had two sons, Gordon and Andrew. The younger, Andrew, became a lawyer, specialising in human rights.
I was about 9 years old, I think, when the Strasbourg judgment came out. I don't remember an awful lot about it because my parents very consciously tried to shield us from all that was going on. My brother was a bit more exposed because he was named in the case, and my mother had asked, could the school give an undertaking that my brother would not be subject to corporal punishment? And the school refused to give that. All my mum wanted was for Gordon and I not to be hit at school. But in order to make that happen, she had to go to court. Going to court in Scotland wasn't really an option because the law in Scotland was really quite clear in the matter that corporal punishment was possible. So my mum had to go to court. There being no judicial route in Scotland or indeed in the UK, the only choice was to go to Strasbourg.
She'd been fighting for 8 years by that time, or approximately 8 years. So, I mean, it wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't a simple case of you apply to Strasbourg and they make the judgment. It was far, far more complex than that. And we had to submit all sorts of information. The only thing we made absolutely sure that we never at any time made any statement which was not 100% factually correct. Mm-hmm. And we also never on any occasion approached the press at all, because that was also forbidden by the strictures of the court.
As a child, I certainly picked up on an awful lot of sort of negativity to us as a family. We had a teacher from the local school who lived at the bottom of our street, and she refused to speak to us for about 20 years, actually. Ironically, her son became a primary school teacher, and his views were the exact opposite, because he hadn't been brought up to use punishment as a tool for education. And so the local the local situation wasn't great. I've seen some correspondence at home where people were trying to sort of apply pressure to the family. I remember we came back from a long weekend away and there was graffiti daubed on the front door of the house, and it was made to look like children's handwriting, but it was too well done. And even as a child of 12, I could tell, that wasn't a child's handwriting, but it was made to look like that. We had bricks through the lounge window. We were aware that our telephone was being bugged.
The press reaction was totally hostile, as was the attitude of the unions, both teaching unions and non-teaching unions, and the government and the local authority, and virtually everyone we knew.
She used to get a lot of stress headaches, and she died about 3 years after the judgment. 3 years after the judgment was final in 86, and so when the domestic law changed in 86, and I think at that point I do vividly remember my parents just feeling like there was a weight off their shoulders, because that really was the last gasp. There was nothing else they had to do.
I think in Grace once counted it, and the total number of people who said thank you was 13. 13 of our friends.
But there were a few teachers who believed in the Campbell's fight and formed an association called STOP.
Well, I was actually secretary of the STOP Scotland, which was the Society of Teachers Opposed to Physical Punishment in Scotland. We started off our campaign in Scotland in 1978, at a time when the majority of teachers in Scotland, perhaps around about 75% of the teachers in Scotland, wanted to keep physical punishment in Scottish schools, which was the system was the belt, which was administered on the hand. The majority of teachers in Scotland at that time felt that was necessary to maintain discipline in Scottish schools. We didn't feel that was necessary. We thought discipline could be maintained in other ways, in non-violent ways. And the basic philosophy of the Ban the Belt campaign was that so long as you have physical punishment in the schools, then you're teaching the message that violence is a way to solve problems, not just in schools, but in society. And so therefore, if there are problems in society as a whole, a lot of violence, a lot of murder, a lot of mayhem, then the schools may have been to some extent responsible for that. And so that was the main driving force behind our campaign.
I think a human rights approach leads to respecting people. And it's about respecting everybody, in this case, involved in education in schools. So it's children's rights, but it's also recognizing that teachers and other staff and parents all have human rights. But what I think is so valuable is when you put that lens on in terms of considering children, is you realize that children should be and are deserving of respect. Again, they're not these empty vessels that perhaps traditionally might have been thought that will just fill them up with all good learning and discipline them, and hopefully they'll come out of that as the adults we want. But I think, again, realizing that children are people, that their rights need to be respected, and that's actually the society that we should and want to be in. So yes, I'm a firm promoter of children's rights.
As I say, it's difficult to convey that now, but at the time, teachers in Scotland particularly, very, very well respected. Society looked up to teachers. Whatever a teacher said was taken as gospel truth. So if they said they couldn't teach without use of corporal punishment, then obviously that was true.
It had always been recognised in Scotland that teachers have a special role in the development of children, and it was assumed for hundreds of years that included punishment if the children were bad in some way, or naughty, or had done something wrong. But of course, what is legitimate punishment and illegitimate punishment is always was open to debate. The traditional Scottish means of physical punishment was the belt, a big leather strap, and you would put your hands out like this, two hands, and the teacher would put down the belt on your hand. And when I was at school, this was in the 60s and 70s, this was very common. You know, somebody would get the belt every day.
If you take the population as a whole, people are slow to change their deeply held, deeply rooted prejudices. And unfortunately in Scotland, and indeed in England too, there was this long-standing belief that corporal punishment was part of the educational process. And to some extent, the older generation, you still say, when they read in the papers about teenagers misbehaving, for instance, they'll say, "Oh yes, time they brought back the belt." You know, I mean, but among teachers, I would say that is now a minority view, and I think there's very few people within the teaching profession today. And I'm retired now, but from what I hear and read in the newspapers, very few official teachers would want to bring back the belt.
30 years on, if you ask anybody who is under 40, do they think corporal punishment is a sensible thing? They will go, what? That society has changed, that the law has managed to lead that change. I'm impossibly proud of my parents about that.
After the court's judgment, children's human rights in Scotland were no longer questioned.
And I'm struck when reading the judgment now that actually the case was really quite surprising to have won in many ways, because there were quite a lot of arguments that the government had raised, and which even the court's own previous decisions would have led you to believe that the case would have been thrown out. But I think I'm told that the turning point was pretty much when the government said, if you take away corporal punishment, then how can we possibly teach our children? And obviously for most of the judges in the court, they came from jurisdictions where corporal punishment had been abolished decades and decades before.
A very practical point. The Campbell case was, it's one of those ones you always hear about in terms of children's rights, because to actually ban the corporal punishment of children in schools is a fundamental children's rights issue. Since then, we know the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child have very firmly and repeatedly come out that it is unacceptable to allow corporal punishment of children by their parents or by schools. So it's a fundamental children's rights issue, and that Campbell case really meant that in terms of state schools, corporal punishment was banned in Scotland and indeed elsewhere in the UK. So that's such an achievement. There is an irony that the actual court decision and the way it got into court and the way it was decided is that at its core of it was actually decided on the basis of parental rights. It wasn't about the children's philosophical conventions. They didn't win on it being degrading treatment under those particular facts of the case. It was at its core about parental rights and corporal punishment being against their philosophical convictions.
One of the things that's quite interesting about the case is that the court held it was all about parents' rights, not children's rights. It's just the way that the case ended up. But nevertheless, it had a profound effect on the position in Scotland, because the government immediately had to pass some legislation simply prohibiting all sorts of corporal punishment. It first of all wanted to draw up a register of parents who were willing to allow their children to be physically beaten and those who were not willing for this. But that's unworkable, because you would have two pupils in the same school, one of whom could have some sort of punishment and the other it would be a different. So that was never going to work. And eventually they realised the only way to do it is to prohibit all sorts of physical punishment.
I think on a personal level, the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law, and Scottish law in particular, has been, I think, an amazingly positive development. It has crystallised something that has been there for a long, long time in Scots law. Concepts of fairness and doing the right thing. but it has given it a more a proper structure. So human rights now is mainstream. It's not regarded as some wacky idea, and it has benefits, real benefits for real people. And the fact that it's now something that is part of Scots law means that people don't have to take out huge overdrafts, borrow lots of money, as my parents did, to try and fund cases to go to Strasbourg. Taking the case to Strasbourg now is not quite a thing of the past, but it's getting there, because now you can go to the court locally and say, my human rights are being infringed, and you'll get a hearing there.
But I think gradually in Scotland, there's been a move to recognise children as citizens and people now, and not just about their futures. That has been sometimes painfully, not always consistently done, but I think that is a very positive move towards that. And I think that's exemplified when the Scottish Parliament got devolved legislation, and one of the first pieces of legislation the Scottish Parliament wanted to put forward was on education. So that was in 2000. And within it, there was made a really important legal change. So before the 2000 Act, local government, the state, had a responsibility to educate children. And parents had the duty that their children had to be educated, but children in themselves had no right to be educated. I think also very relevant in terms of where hopefully we're getting to in Scotland was a rather dramatic flourish actually at the end of legislation going through Parliament, where consortium, I was involved in that, put forward an amendment that would also mean that children's views had to be considered in that. So at the very last stage of Parliament, it was all very dramatic. The politicians really came and supported this idea that not only should schooling being about children's well-being, about developing their fullest potential, but we would also recognise that their views are really important in that they have something really valuable to say about making school an environment and a place that really meets their rights.
The Scottish Government has placed children at the very heart of all its social policies. And there's going to be, for example, a new bill before the Scottish Parliament in January or February 2013, which will require all local authorities, all government agencies, every public body to have at the heart of their policies the effect these policies will have on children. At the moment, legally, we construct it as parents' rights, and this new bill will reverse that and construct things in terms of children's rights.
The decision in Strasbourg had ramifications not only in Britain, but in several parts of the world. In particular, Australia, New Zealand, America. If you believe strongly in something, you have to do something about it. I mean, you can't sit back and expect someone else to do it. I'm sorry, it's that simple.